At first, the Mustang pilot thought it was a mistake, not enemy skill, not a new tactic, a mistake in the eye, because nothing in the European sky was supposed to move like that. By late war, P-51 pilots had learned the shape of danger almost before thinking about it. They knew how a Bf-109 climbed when it still had energy left. They knew the angle an FPA-109 preferred before breaking into a hard turn. They knew the difference between a pilot trying to drag them low and one trying to escape. Air combat had its own language by then, and the men flying escort over Germany had become fluent in it. Fast glance, instant judgment, friend, enemy, altitude, intent. That was how survival worked. You saw the shape, you read the motion, you reacted before the other man finished his idea. But this time the eye found something it could not read, a streak, a flash of gray-white cutting through the upper air so quickly that for 1/6 second it barely looked like an airplane at all. It did not enter the fight the way enemy fighters normally entered a fight. No measured approach, no visible build in speed, no long curve into attack position. It simply appeared, crossing the sky with such violence that the Mustang pilot's first instinct was not aggression. It was disbelief, because fighters were not supposed to arrive like artillery. The object tore past the formation and was gone almost before the mind had time to place it. No proper turn to follow. No immediate chance to pursue, just a shockwave of realization spreading through pilots who had spent months mastering the rules of piston engine combat and had just seen something that seemed to belong to another war. That was the first real effect of the Me-163 Komet, not destruction, disorientation. The Komet was not simply faster than the aircraft around it. Faster was too small a word. Plenty of fighters were faster in dives, faster at certain altitudes, faster in certain conditions. Pilots understood speed as an advantage. What they were not ready for was speed that broke recognition itself. The Me-163 did not feel like a better version of a fighter they already knew. It felt like something that had slipped into the sky before aviation had agreed how to deal with it, and that made it dangerous in a way raw performance numbers never fully capture. Because air combat depends on prediction. Even the most violent dogfight is built on expectation. You estimate closure. You judge angle. You guess when the other pilot will commit, when he will pull, when he will fire, when he will panic. Experience lets a man survive because experience teaches pattern. But the Komet shattered pattern. It compressed time so brutally that the familiar space between seeing and reacting almost vanished. That was why the first encounters felt wrong, not merely difficult. Wrong. The Mustang force that day had gone up, expecting the usual threats of Reich defense. German fighters perhaps climbing through broken cloud or diving from altitude, trying to slash at bombers and escape. It was dangerous work, but it was familiar danger. Escort pilots had learned how to think inside that system. They knew what to protect, what to chase, what not to chase, and how to keep one eye on the bombers while reading the sky for movement. Then the Komet entered that equation, and all the old timing broke. The P-51 was one of the finest escort fighters of the war, because it balanced everything a pilot needed: range, speed, stability, altitude performance, and enough grace in combat to turn discipline into survival. It was not the sort of aircraft that frightened easily. In the hands of an experienced pilot, the Mustang could meet almost anything in Europe with confidence. That confidence mattered. A fighter pilot who trusts his aircraft fights earlier, harder, and with clearer judgment than one already doubting the machine around him. But confidence has limits, and one of those limits appears when the enemy crosses your nose so fast that you cannot tell whether he attacked you, missed you, or was never really in your fight to begin with. That was the Komet's strange power. It did not always dominate the sky in the traditional sense. It did something more unsettling. It made normal fighters feel late inside their own battle. The first pass proved it. One moment, the Mustangs were still flying escort logic, scanning, spacing, tracking the bomber stream they were meant to protect, and the next moment a rocket-powered German interceptor ripped through the air with a closure rate that turned judgment into confusion. Heads snapped. Formations loosened. Pilots searched for a turning fight that never formed. Men reached for a response while the attacker was already somewhere else. That was the real beginning of the encounter. Not bullets, not kills, a collapse in timing. For the Mustang pilots, that was a physical sensation before it became a tactical one. You train yourself to trust the interval between sight and action, see the threat, place him, move, but against the Komet, that interval suddenly felt stolen. By the time a pilot recognized what he was looking at, the aircraft had already passed through the space where a decision still mattered. That was not how dogfights were supposed to work, and the men in the P-51s knew it immediately. The Me-163 did not circle into combat like a hunter settling onto prey. It attacked like a thrown blade. One high-speed pass, one burst if the pilot could make it count, then another violent reposition if fuel and timing still allowed. That last part mattered more than many expected. The Komet looked like the future in motion, but it was a narrow kind of future. Brilliant, terrifying, and limited. It burned fuel at a savage rate. Its combat window was brutally short. Its attack had to matter fast, because the aircraft did not belong in a long fight. It belonged in a single shocking intrusion. That was why nobody was truly ready for it. The Americans were not ready because their instincts had been trained by aircraft that still behaved like aircraft. And many Germans were not fully ready either, because the Komet demanded a style of combat so compressed, so unforgiving, that even its own promise came with danger built into it. But in the first instant of contact, none of that subtlety mattered to the Mustang pilots. What mattered was what the sky suddenly felt like, unstable, not because there were too many enemies, because the enemy no longer moved inside the same logic. A Mustang pilot can fight fear when fear has shape. A turning 109, a diving 109, a diving 109. Even a bad tactical position can be endured if the brain still believes it understands the terms. But the Komet disrupted the terms themselves. It made a veteran pilot feel, for a moment, like a beginner, staring at movement too fast to parse, searching for a place to insert training into a situation that had already outrun it. That was the psychological advantage of the rocket fighter, and it arrived before any tactical conclusion did. The Germans had not put the Me-163 into the sky to win elegant dogfights. They had put it there to break interception by shock, to rush into bomber space so quickly that escort fighters would struggle to place it, stop it, or even meaningfully engage it before the attack had already passed. In theory, it was a weapon designed to puncture certainty itself, and against men used to controlling a fight through timing. That theory had real force. The Mustang formation began adjusting almost immediately, but adjustment is not the same as understanding. Pilots spread their scan wider. Heads moved faster. Men tried to judge where the Komet might reappear, but prediction against ordinary logic does not work when the other machine seems to erase distance rather than cross it. Then it came again, not from the place most expected. That mattered too. A strange aircraft becomes survivable once men can at least assign it a pattern, but the Komet's next appearance only deepened the first shock. Another blistering approach. Another moment where recognition and reaction nearly collided too late to matter. It did not look like a duel yet. It looked like the old air war being interrupted by something impatient with its rules. And in that moment, the P-51 pilots began understanding the true problem. This was not a fight built around maneuver. It was a fight built around fractions of time. And the side that failed to understand that first was going to lose the meaning of the battle before it ever lost the sky. This was not a fight built around maneuver. It was a fight built around fractions of time. That was the first truth the Mustang pilots had to absorb if they wanted to survive the Komet. A normal fighter duel gives a man room to think inside motion. He sees the enemy commit, reads the angle, senses where the turn will tighten, where the climb will bleed speed, where the mistake might appear. Even in chaos, there is a rhythm to it. The Me-163 shattered that rhythm. It did not stay in the fight long enough to let another pilot solve it through instinct. It arrived. It struck. It vanished. That was the pattern. And once the P-51 pilots understood that, the entire meaning of the battle changed. This was no longer about outturning the enemy or dragging him into a longer exchange. The Komet did not want a longer exchange. In some ways, it could not afford one. Its terrifying speed came at a cost. The aircraft burned through its fuel with savage hunger, which meant every attack run was part assault, part countdown. The Komet looked unstoppable when it entered the fight, but hidden inside that violence was desperation. It had only a short window to matter. That was the weakness the Mustangs had to recognize, but recognizing a weakness is not the same as exploiting it, especially when the thing carrying that weakness still looked like a missile with a pilot inside it. The second pass made that painfully clear. The Komet came in with the same impossible closure, but now the Mustang pilots were trying to read not just the aircraft, but its intention. Was it diving on the bombers? Slashing through the escorts? Trying to force the Mustangs to scatter before lining up another attack? Nobody could answer cleanly in the moment, because the speed of the machine kept compressing every question into raw reaction. Heads turned. Formations flexed. A few pilots instinctively tried to swing toward the threat, but turning toward something that fast felt like trying to grab a bullet after it had already passed your hand. The Komet crossed through the air with a kind of mechanical violence that made ordinary fighter movement look almost patient by comparison. It was still an airplane, but it no longer behaved like one the P-51 men had spent the war learning how to fight. That was what made the encounter feel so unnatural. A P-51 pilot trusted the relationship between engine power, altitude, speed, and turning room. He understood combat as a problem with variables that could be managed by discipline. The Me-163 did not erase those variables. It overwhelmed them before they could settle into anything usable. In the first seconds of each approach, the Mustang pilot was not really countering the Komet. He was catching up to the fact that it was already there. That delay was everything. Because air combat belongs to the man who understands the fight first. And for a few terrible moments, the Germans had that advantage. The Komet pilot knew exactly what kind of confusion he was causing. He was not trying to build a graceful duel. He was using velocity to rip open the Americans' timing. A formation that cannot settle, cannot predict. A pilot who cannot predict cannot choose well. That was the logic behind the rocket interceptor. It turned speed into psychological force before it ever turned it into gunfire. But there was another side to that logic, and the Mustang pilots began to sense it. The Komet's speed made it hard to fight. It also made it hard to control. An aircraft entering combat that fast has fewer forgiving moments. A firing window closes almost as soon as it opens. A slight error in angle becomes a miss before correction is possible. A pilot can terrify the enemy and still fail to achieve much if the pass is even slightly wrong. The Komet was not a machine built for patient domination. It was built for one sudden, violent opportunity. If that opportunity slipped, much of its power slipped with it. That was the beginning of the American adjustment. Not comfort. Adjustment. The Mustangs could not make the Komet slow down. They could not force it into a normal dogfight on command. But they could stop expecting one. That shift mattered. The moment a pilot stops waiting for the wrong battle, he starts surviving the real one. Instead of chasing the Komet's speed directly, the smarter P-51 pilots began thinking in terms of position and aftermath, not where the aircraft was, where it would no longer want to be once the attack run ended. That was a colder way to fight, and a more effective one. The next time the Komet flashed through, the Mustangs were less shocked than before, though no less aware of the danger. They had begun to understand that the enemy's greatest strength was concentrated into moments, not minutes. The rocket fighter could own a pass. It could dominate an instant. But an instant is not a whole battle unless the rest of the sky allows it to become one. That was where the P-51 still mattered. The Mustang was the opposite of the Komet in almost every meaningful way. It was not a weapon of one brutal flash. It was control, endurance, reach, a machine that let a pilot remain inside the fight long enough to shape it. If the Komet was a blade thrown at high speed, the Mustang was a hand that could stay steady after the throw. That contrast now defined the encounter more clearly than nationality, markings, or raw performance ever could. One aircraft represented violent interruption, the other represented sustained command. And in the space between those two ideas, the real battle was forming. The Germans had built something that could break into the familiar order of escort combat like a weapon from the future. But the future had arrived with limits attached. The Me-163 could shock men, scare them, even kill them if its pass was true. Yet every second it spent in the air also pushed it closer to the edge of its own usefulness. Fuel, timing, angle, recovery. All of it was working against the pilot, almost as hard as the enemy was. The Mustang pilots were beginning to realize that they did not need to beat the Komet at its own speed. They needed to survive its moment, because once that moment passed, the strange balance of the fight would begin to shift. And for the first time since the rocket fighter had torn into their sky, some of the P-51 men could feel that shift beginning. Not in victory, not yet, but in understanding. And once a pilot understands the shape of a threat, fear starts turning back into method. Not in victory, not yet, but in understanding. That was the point where the fight stopped belonging entirely to the Komet. Shock is powerful, but shock has a short life. The first sight of the Me-163 had torn open the old instincts of the Mustang pilots because it arrived too fast to fit inside any pattern they knew. But once a pilot survives that first confusion, the mind begins doing what trained minds do best. It starts rebuilding order. The Americans still could not turn the Komet into a normal opponent. They could not force it into a clean dogfight. They could not make it slow enough to feel familiar. But they no longer needed familiarity. They needed clarity. And clarity was beginning to return. The P-51 pilots had started to understand the deeper truth of the rocket fighter. Its speed was terrifying, but its speed was also a cage. Everything about the Me-163 was compressed. Approach, attack, firing chance, escape, fuel, decision. It entered the fight like an explosion, yet an explosion does not stay. It spends itself. The Komet could dominate a moment, but a moment was only useful if it produced something decisive before the aircraft's own limits began closing around it. That was the real weakness now emerging through the terror. The Mustang pilots could feel it without needing to measure it precisely. The Komet's passes were violent, but brief. Its appearances were sudden, but never comfortable. It was not moving through the battle with control. It was passing through it with urgency. And urgency, once recognized, changes the meaning of fear. What first looked like unstoppable power starts looking like power in a hurry. That mattered, because now the fight no longer felt like an encounter with magic. It felt like an encounter with a weapon that had one idea, and needed that idea to work fast. The next appearance of the Me-163 no longer shattered the entire sky, the way the first one had. It still shocked the eye. It still crossed the air with an unnatural speed that made ordinary fighters seem rooted to another age. But the Mustangs were no longer trying to solve it as if it were a turning opponent. They were watching the attack lane, watching the exit, watching the place where that impossible machine would have to become vulnerable simply by continuing to exist. That was the hidden turning point. The Komet had changed air combat because it exposed a brutal new fact. Speed alone could now rewrite the opening terms of a fight. It could steal reaction time. It could humiliate old instincts. It could make experienced pilots feel late inside their own sky. But the other lesson mattered just as much. An aircraft built almost entirely around one overwhelming advantage also risked being trapped by that advantage. If the pass failed, if the target adjusted just enough, then the rocket fighter was left carrying all its brilliance into a shrinking future. The P-51 represented the opposite truth. The P-51 represented the opposite truth. It was not spectacular in the Komet's way. It did not arrive like a missile. It did not make men stare in disbelief. What it offered instead was something war usually values more in the end. Usable control, time to judge, time to remain in the fight, time to recover from surprise and turn survival back into method. The Mustang was dangerous not because it shocked the battle, but because it could stay inside the battle long enough to understand it. That contrast was the real story of the encounter. Not merely German innovation against American skill, not simply rocket power against piston power. It was two entirely different ideas of air combat meeting in the same sky. One idea said the future belonged to violent speed. The other said a fight still had to be lived through, not just entered. And when those two ideas collided, nobody was fully ready, not the Mustang pilots seeing something they had never truly imagined, and not even the Komet itself, because the very thing that made it revolutionary also kept it from becoming complete. That was why this encounter mattered far beyond one pass, one pilot, or one frightened glance through a canopy. The Me-163 proved that the old visual rhythm of fighter combat could be broken. A pilot could no longer assume he would always have enough time to interpret, react, and shape the first seconds of an engagement. Technology had started compressing the sky. Closure rates, attack windows, and human judgment were moving toward a point where instinct alone would no longer be enough. In that sense, the Komet was a warning, as much as a weapon. It showed what happened when aircraft performance began outrunning the habits pilots had built in earlier years of the war. The P-51's answer was not to become something else. It was to endure long enough to understand. That answer mattered too, because the future of air combat was never going to belong entirely to speed, or entirely to shock, or entirely to machines that turned battle into one brutal second. It would belong to whichever side could combine performance with control, violence with repeatability, innovation with a way to survive after the first surprise was gone. And in that sky that day, the Mustang pilots were beginning to see exactly that. The Komet was real, its speed was real, its terror was real, but so were its limits. Once that realization took hold, the encounter stopped being a mystery and became a lesson. The rocket fighter had not made conventional fighters obsolete in a single flash of brilliance. What it had done was force everyone who saw it to understand that the rules were starting to change. Faster aircraft would come, shorter reaction windows would come, stranger fights would come. The old confidence that every air battle could be read like the last one was already dying. That was what nobody had been ready for, not just the machine itself. The meaning of it, because in the end, the Me-163 was more than a dangerous German interceptor, and the P-51 was more than the fighter trying to survive it. Together, in that brief and unnatural confrontation, they revealed a border between two ages of combat, one still governed by familiar maneuver, the other rushing toward a future where speed would tear decision-making down to fractions. And once pilots saw that future cross their nose, they could never fully unsee it. The Me-163 shocked the Mustang not simply by being faster, but by breaking the old timing of fighter combat. It turned the first seconds of the encounter into confusion, forcing experienced pilots to fight an aircraft that seemed to arrive before thought itself. That was the lesson. The Komet proved that air combat was changing, and the P-51 proved that surviving the future would depend not just on speed, but on understanding what speed had done to the fight.